The air was thick with tension. Colonel James Turner stood at the boarding gate, his sharp, decorated uniform drawing attention from onlookers. But it wasn't admiration in their eyes. It was suspicion. The airline attendant, a middle-aged man with a stern face, blocked the way, his hand raised as if to halt a criminal. "I'm sorry, sir, but you won't be boarding this flight," the attendant said, his voice cold and final. James's heart pounded. "What do you mean?" "I'm escorting a fallen soldier home. His family is waiting." He gestured toward the flag-draped coffin visible through the terminal window. "I understand, sir, but this is a full flight. We've given your seat to someone else." The man's tone dripped with insincerity, and his eyes flicked down to the color of James's skin, betraying his true intentions. Passengers whispered and glanced nervously as James clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. He could feel the weight of history pressing down on him. Another black man disrespected in a uniform that should command respect. "You're making a mistake," James said, his voice steady but filled with controlled anger. "That soldier gave his life for this country, and I'll be damned if I let him make his final journey alone." The attendant sneered slightly, then turned away as if dismissing him altogether. "You can take it up with customer service," he said over his shoulder, already motioning for the next passenger. James didn't move. He stood rooted to the spot, his eyes locked on the attendant. Then, from behind him, a voice rang out. "This isn't right." Heads turned as a young woman, her face pale with indignation, stepped forward. "Let him on the plane," she shouted, her voice breaking the stunned silence. James felt a spark of hope, but the attendant remained unmoved. Instead, he reached for his radio, muttering something about security. Within moments, two airport officers approached, their hands resting on their belts. "Sir, we need you to step aside," one of them said. James took a deep breath, his mind racing. This wasn't about a seat. It was about dignity, about justice. And as the officers closed in, he realized this was far from over. Earlier that day, James had woken up before dawn, his mind focused on the solemn task ahead. He'd been chosen to escort Private First Class Kyle Matthews, a 22-year-old soldier who had died in combat, back to his hometown in Ohio. James didn't know Kyle personally, but he had read the letters from his family, seen the photos of him laughing with his younger siblings, and felt the weight of their grief. This was more than a duty, it was a promise to the fallen and their loved ones. The journey had started smoothly. James left his base in Virginia, arriving at the airport with ample time to spare. He checked in, greeted staff, and even exchanged a few words with fellow passengers. Some nodded respectfully at his uniform, while others offered quiet smiles. But as he approached the gate for the final leg of his journey, something shifted. The attendant barely glanced at James's papers before telling him there was a problem. He claimed the system had overbooked the flight and insisted James would have to wait for another. When James protested, explaining the importance of his mission, the man's polite facade cracked. "You're not the only one who's got places to be," he said curtly. James could tell this wasn't about logistics. He'd seen this kind of behavior before, the subtle, cutting ways some people undermined others based on their race. He had endured it as a young officer, fighting twice as hard for half the recognition, and now, even as a colonel, it seemed he wasn't immune. Still, he remained calm. "Is there a supervisor I can speak to?" The attendant smirked. "I am the supervisor." For a moment, James considered stepping back, calling someone from the airline's military liaison office. But time was running out. The flight was boarding, and Kyle's casket needed to be on that plane. While James stood at the counter, his thoughts briefly flicked back to his family. He pictured his wife, Sarah, and her two kids, hoping they'd never have to face moments like this. He taught them to be proud of who they were, but how could he explain this kind of injustice? The final boarding call rang out, jolting him back to the present. As the last passengers began to file through the gate, James made one last plea. "Please, don't do this." The attendant gave him a tight smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes, and said, "You can catch the next flight." James watched as the man turned his back, dismissing him completely. He stood there, his chest tight with a mix of frustration and disbelief, as the door to the jet bridge closed. It was then that he heard the voice of the young woman. She was a few feet away, her face flushed with anger. "This man deserves to be on that plane," she said, her voice rising. "Why are you treating him like this?" Other passengers began to murmur, some looking uncomfortable, others nodding in agreement. The woman stepped closer to James, her eyes blazing. "You're not alone," she said softly. For the first time in what felt like hours, James felt a flicker of hope. But that hope was quickly overshadowed as the airport officers arrived. "Sir, we need to escort you to another area," one of them said firmly. James straightened his shoulders, refusing to be intimidated. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice steady. "Not until that soldier is on his way home." The officers exchanged a look, their hands hovering near their radios. The tension in the air was palpable, and James knew this was about to escalate. "Colonel Turner, we can do this the easy way or the hard way," the officer said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. James glanced at the casket one last time, then back at the officers. He could feel the weight of the passengers' eyes on him, their silence a mix of fear and support. He took a deep breath, preparing himself for what came next. The air seemed to thicken as the officers stood poised, waiting for James's next move. For a moment, the terminal was silent, the kind of silence that comes before a storm. Then James raised his hands slowly, not in surrender but in a gesture meant to diffuse the tension. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "I'm here to do my duty, just like I have for the past 25 years. He looked directly at the lead officer, his gaze steady. "Let's not make this worse than it already is." The officer hesitated, glancing at his partner. The tension in the room shifted slightly as passengers began to speak up. "This is ridiculous," an older man muttered. "The guy's a colonel, for crying out loud." "Let him board," someone else called out. The young woman who had first spoken up stepped forward again, her voice rising with conviction. "You're about to drag a soldier off this flight while he's escorting a fallen hero. What kind of message does that send?" The officers exchanged another uneasy glance. It was clear they hadn't expected this kind of public backlash. But the attendant at the gate remained unmoved. "Rules are rules," he said, his voice clicked. "Overbooking happens, it's unfortunate, but we can't accommodate everyone." James felt a surge of anger, but he forced himself to stay composed. He knew losing his temper would only play into their hands. Instead, he turned to the crowd. "I'm not asking for special treatment," he said, his voice carrying through the terminal. "I'm asking for respect, for me, for my uniform, and most importantly, for the soldier I'm escorting. Private Matthews gave his life for this country. The least we can do is ensure he gets home with the dignity he deserves." A ripple of agreement passed through the crowd. The murmurs grew louder, passengers turning their frustration toward the airline staff. "This is disgraceful," an elderly woman said, shaking her head. "I've flown with this airline for years, but I won't after this." The lead officer stepped aside slightly, clearly conflicted. "Colonel, if you're willing to wait, I can personally ensure you're on the next available flight," he said, trying to offer a compromise. James shook his head. "That's not good enough. His family is waiting. They've been through enough already." At that moment, a man in a pilot's uniform emerged from the jet bridge, his face stern. Captain Michael Evans had been flying for over 2 decades, and he'd seen his fair share of difficult situations. But when he heard the commotion at the gate, he decided to intervene. "What's going on here?" he asked, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. The gate attendant stepped forward, his demeanor slightly less confident now. "We've got an overbooking issue, Captain. This gentleman will need to wait for the next flight." Evans looked at James, then at the casket visible through the window. His jaw tightened. "This gentleman is a colonel in the United States Army," he said, his voice low but firm. "And he's escorting a fallen soldier. Is that correct, Colonel?" "Yes, sir," James replied, standing tall. Evans nodded, then turned back to the attendant. "And you thought it was a good idea to deny him boarding?" The attendant's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The passengers watched, their silence now expectant. Evans didn't wait for an answer. He turned to the officers. "Thank you, gentlemen, but your services won't be needed here." The officers hesitated, then nodded and stepped back, clearly relieved to be out of the spotlight. "Now," Evans continued, addressing the attendant, "I'll take full responsibility for this flight. Colonel Turner will board, and so will Private Matthews." He looked around the terminal, his gaze sweeping over the passengers. "If anyone here has an issue with that, I'll be happy to have a word with them myself." No one spoke. The room was filled with a tense, waiting silence. Finally, the gate attendant gave a reluctant nod and opened the door to the jet bridge. "Thank you, Captain," James said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Evans placed a hand on his shoulder. "You shouldn't have had to fight for this, Colonel. Let's get that young man home." As James walked down the jet bridge, the tension in his chest began to ease, but even as he prepared for the solemn flight ahead, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the battle. Back on the plane, the atmosphere was subdued. Passengers watched quietly as James took his seat, the weight of what had just happened settling over them. He sat near the front, close to the casket, his mind replaying the events at the gate. The plane taxied and took off smoothly, but James's thoughts were far from calm. He couldn't stop thinking about Kyle's family, how they would react when he told them what had happened. And what about the broader implications? How many other service members had faced similar indignities, their sacrifices overlooked or dismissed? He stared out the window, the clouds below him a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside. The flight was uneventful, but James barely noticed. He was lost in his thoughts, planning his next steps. He knew he couldn't let this incident pass without action. Someone had to be held accountable, and changes needed to be made. When the plane finally landed, James straightened his uniform and prepared to disembark. The family would be waiting at the gate, their grief raw but mixed with pride for their son's service. As he stepped off the plane, the gravity of his responsibility hit him once again. He carried not just the weight of a young soldier's life, but the unspoken burden of fighting for the respect and recognition that should have been automatic. The terminal was quiet as he walked toward the family, but just as he was about to speak, a commotion erupted behind him. "Excuse me," a voice shouted. James turned to see a man in a business suit rushing toward him, flanked by 2 airline employees. His face was flushed, and he looked as though he'd been running. "Colonel Turner," the man said, slightly out of breath. "I'm the regional manager for the airline. I just received word about what happened." He'd extended a hand, his expression earnest. "On behalf of the airline, I want to personally apologize for the unacceptable treatment you experienced today." James hesitated, then shook the man's hand. "It's not just about me," he said. "It's about respect for all service members, for all people." The manager nodded, his face serious. "We're committed to making this right. I'd like to meet with you to discuss how we can ensure this never happens again." James glanced back at Kyle's family, then at the casket being unloaded onto the tarmac. He nodded slowly. "We'll talk," he said. But as he turned back to the family, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. James composed himself as he approached Kyle's family. They stood in a small group near the gate, their eyes red and faces etched with sorrow. Kyle's mother, a petite woman in her late 40s, clutched a folded handkerchief, her hands trembling. Beside her, Kyle's father, a stoic man with a firm jaw, rested a hand on her shoulder, his own grief barely contained. Kyle's younger sister, no older than 12, clung to her mother's side, her wide eyes fixed on the casket being carefully loaded onto a cart. James stopped a few feet away and removed his hat, holding it over his heart. "Mr. and Mrs. Matthews," he began softly, "I'm Colonel James Turner. It's an honor to escort your son home." Mrs. Matthews nodded, her lips quivering. "Thank you, Colonel. We're grateful for everything you've done." Her voice broke on the last word, and she turned to her husband, who gave her a comforting squeeze. "We're proud of Kyle," Mr. Matthews said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "He always wanted to serve, to make a difference." James nodded, feeling the weight of their loss. He served with courage and honor. His sacrifice won't be forgotten. The family fell silent, their eyes drawn to the casket as it was carefully placed onto a hearse waiting on the tarmac. The sight of the flag-draped coffin brought fresh tears to Mrs. Matthews' eyes. After a few moments, James spoke again. "There's something I need to tell you," he said carefully. "Something that happened during the flight." The family looked at him, their expressions shifting from grief to concern. James took a deep breath and explained the incident at the gate, his voice calm but unwavering. He recounted how the airline had tried to deny him boarding, how passengers had stood up for him, and how the captain had intervened. By the time he finished, Mrs. Matthews' hands were clenched tightly around her handkerchief. "They tried to stop you," she said, her voice a mix of disbelief and anger, "while you were bringing my son home." James nodded. "It was right, and I'm going to make sure it doesn't happen again. I've already spoken with the airline's regional manager. They'd promised to address it." Mr. Matthews' jaw tightened, his eyes dark. "That's not enough. They need to be held accountable." "They will be," James assured him. "But for now, I want to focus on honoring Kyle. He deserves our full attention." Mrs. Matthews wiped her eyes and nodded. "Thank you, Colonel, for everything." James placed a hand over his heart. "It's my duty and my privilege." The family followed the hearse out to the tarmac, where a small honor guard awaited to perform a final salute. James stood with them, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on the coffin as the soldiers folded the flag with precision. As the ceremony concluded, James felt a deep sense of responsibility. This moment wasn't just about Kyle. It was about every service member who had ever been treated unfairly, about every family that had suffered a loss. Later, as the family departed for the funeral home, James lingered at the airport. The regional manager, still visibly uneasy, approached him again. "Colonel Turner, I'd like to schedule a formal meeting to discuss what happened," the manager said. "We need to hear your perspective and find a way to make things right." James nodded. "I'll be in touch. But this can't be a one-time conversation. Your policies need to change, and your staff needs to be trained properly." The manager agreed, promising to follow up soon. James left the airport with a heavy heart, but his resolve was stronger than ever. The next few days passed in a blur of solemn duties and quiet reflection. He attended Kyle's funeral, where the community turned out in large numbers to honor the young soldier. After the service, James returned to his base, determined to use his position to effect change. He began drafting a detailed report of the incident, including statements from witnesses and documentation of his conversations with the airline. But just as he was finalizing the report, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was an unfamiliar number, but James answered anyway. "Colonel Turner," a deep voice asked. "Yes, this is he." "This is Major General Samuel Harper, Pentagon Office of Public Affairs. I've been briefed on what happened during your flight. We'd like you to come to Washington to discuss this matter further." James's grip on the phone tightened. He hadn't expected the issue to reach such high levels so quickly. "Of course, sir," he said. "I'll make arrangements to travel as soon as possible." "Good," General Harper said. "This kind of incident cannot be ignored. We'll see you soon, Colonel." The call ended, leaving James staring at his phone. His mind raced with questions. Why was the Pentagon taking such an interest? What exactly did they want to discuss? He had a feeling that this meeting would open a new chapter in his fight for justice. The flight to Washington, D.C. was uneventful, but James's mind was anything but calm. He spent the entire trip replaying the phone call with Major General Harper and reviewing the incident at the airport. Whatever awaited him at the Pentagon, he knew it wouldn't just be a casual conversation. When James arrived, a black government sedan was waiting for him. A sharply dressed driver stepped out and saluted. "Colonel Turner, sir, I'll be escorting you to the Pentagon." James returned the salute and climbed into the car. The ride through D.C.'s bustling streets was short, and soon they were pulling up to the massive fortress-like structure of the Pentagon. Inside, an aide met him and led him through a maze of corridors. Finally, they arrived at a sleek conference room where Major General Harper stood waiting. Harper was a tall, imposing man in his late 50s, with sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Colonel Turner," Harper said, extending a hand. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." James shook his hand firmly. "It's an honor, sir." Harper gestured to a seat. "Please sit. We have much to discuss." James took a seat, his back straight, as Harper settled across from him. "We've reviewed the incident at the airport," Harper began, sliding a folder across the table. "And let me be clear, what you experienced is unacceptable. It's not just a matter of protocol, it's a matter of principle." James opened the folder and saw a detailed summary of the incident, including passenger testimonies and a statement from Captain Evans. "Colonel, incidents like these are more common than they should be," Harper continued. "We've had reports of service members, particularly those of color, facing discrimination while in uniform. This is a systemic issue, and it tarnishes the respect and dignity our military personnel deserve." James nodded. "I've seen it firsthand, sir. It's not just about me. It's not the message it sends to every soldier who looks like me. We fight for this country, but sometimes it feels like the country doesn't fight for us." Harper's expression grew serious. "That's exactly why you're here. We want you to be part of a task force we're forming. Its mission will be to identify and address discriminatory practices that affect service members, both within and outside the military. Your experience and perspective will be invaluable." James's eyes widened slightly. This was more than he had expected. "Sir, I'm honored. But I have to ask, will this task force have real authority? Will we be able to enact change, or will it just be a symbolic gesture?" Harper leaned forward, his tone firm. "This isn't for show, Colonel. We've got the backing of the Secretary of Defense. He'll have access to resources and the power to recommend policy changes. We're serious about making a difference." James considered this for a moment, then nodded. "I'm in, sir. Whatever it takes." "Good." Harper stood and extended his hand again. "Welcome aboard, Colonel Turner. You'll be working closely with our team here, as well as civilian experts and advocacy groups. Your first task will be to draft a report on your experience and propose initial recommendations. James shook Harper's hand, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. I won't let you down, sir. As the meeting wrapped up, James was introduced to several members of the task force, including Lieutenant Commander Rachel Simmons, a Navy officer with a background in civil rights law, and Dr. Alan Jacobs, a civilian expert on organizational bias. They briefed him on the task force's early initiatives and the challenges ahead. That evening, James returned to his hotel room, his mind buzzing with ideas. He began drafting his report, drawing not only from his recent experience but also from the countless stories he'd heard from fellow service members over the years. The next morning, as he prepared to head back to the Pentagon, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Colonel Turner, this is Lisa Bradford, investigative journalist with the Washington Post. I'm looking into reports of discrimination against service members and heard about your recent experience. Would you be willing to speak on the record? James stared at the message, his thoughts racing. He knew that going public could amplify the issue, but it could also bring intense scrutiny and backlash. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was Major General Harper. Colonel, I need to speak with you immediately, Harper said, his tone urgent. We just received some troubling news about the airline involved in your incident. Meet me in my office as soon as you can. James quickly gathered his things and headed for the Pentagon, his heart pounding. Whatever Harper had to say, it was clear that the stakes were about to get even higher. When James arrived, Harper didn't waste any time. Colonel, we've uncovered evidence that the airline has a history of discriminatory practices, particularly against military personnel of color. Several employees have come forward, and there's talk of a class action lawsuit. James's eyes narrowed. What kind of evidence are we talking about? Harper handed him a stack of documents, internal emails, complaints from service members, and even a few recorded conversations. It's damning, Colonel, and it's going to hit the press soon. James flipped through the documents, his anger growing with each page. This is bigger than I thought, he said quietly. Harper nodded. It is, and when this story breaks, the spotlight will be on you. You'll need to decide how much you want to say publicly. James set the documents down, his mind racing. He knew this was his chance to make a real impact, but he also knew the risks. His next move would shape not only his own future, but the future of countless others who had faced similar injustices. I'll speak to the journalist, James said finally. But I'll do it on my terms. If we're going to bring this issue to light, we need to make sure the focus stays on the bigger picture. Harper nodded. Agreed. We'll support you every step of the way. As James left the office, he felt a mix of determination and unease. The fight was far from over, and the next battle was about to begin. The weight of the decision to go public pressed heavily on James's shoulders. Speaking with Lisa Bradford from the Washington Post wasn't just about sharing his experience. It was about igniting a national conversation. He knew the risks. His words would be dissected, his motives questioned, and not everyone would rally behind him. But James also knew silence would accomplish nothing. Later that day, he returned to his hotel room and dialed Lisa Bradford's number. She picked up on the first ring, her voice calm but eager. Colonel Turner, thank you for calling. I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. I'll be honest with you, Miss Bradford, James said. This isn't an easy decision. I'm not looking for attention, but I can't let what happened slide. Too many people have been through similar situations, and it's time someone spoke up. Lisa's tone softened. I understand, Colonel. This isn't just about one incident. It's about systemic issues. If you're willing, I'd like to meet in person to get your full story. We can go over everything at your pace, and I'll make sure your voice is represented accurately. James agreed, and they set up a meeting for the next morning at a quiet cafe near the Pentagon. That night, James barely slept. He went over every detail of his experience at the airport, thinking about how to convey the gravity of the situation without letting his emotions take over. The next day, he arrived at the cafe early. Lisa was already there, a notebook and recorder in front of her. She greeted him warmly and offered him a seat. Before we start, I want to assure you, Lisa said, this interview is about truth and accountability. If there's anything you're uncomfortable with, we don't have to include it. James nodded, appreciating her professionalism. Let's do this. For the next 2 hours, James recounted the incident in detail, starting from his arrival at the airport to the confrontation at the gate. He spoke about the blatant discrimination he faced, the passengers who stood by him, and the captain who stepped in to do the right thing. Lisa listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. She also inquired about James's experiences as a black officer of the military, exploring the broader context of discrimination and respect within the armed forces. When the interview concluded, Lisa turned off her recorder and closed her notebook. "Thank you, Colonel. Your story is powerful, and I believe it will resonate with a lot of people." James leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I just hope it makes a difference." "It will," Lisa said confidently. "Once the story goes live, it'll get people talking. And with the evidence coming out about the airline, this could lead to real change." James nodded, but deep down, he knew the road ahead would be rough. A few days later, the article was published under the headline, "Discrimination at 30,000 Feet, a Colonel's Fight for Dignity and Respect." The story quickly gained traction, spreading across social media and major news outlets. People from all walks of life shared their outrage, while others came forward with similar stories of discrimination. Within hours, the airline released a carefully worded statement. "We deeply regret the experience of Colonel Turner and extend our sincerest apologies. We are committed to reviewing our policies and ensuring all passengers are treated with the utmost respect and dignity." But the statement did little to stem the growing backlash. Activists, veterans groups, and politicians began calling for a formal investigation into the airline's practices. James found himself at the center of a media storm. He received dozens of interview requests, but he chose his appearances carefully, focusing on platforms that would highlight the systemic nature of the issue. Amid the growing attention, James received a call from an unexpected source, Senator Elaine Crawford, a vocal advocate for veterans' rights. "Colonel Turner," she began, her voice firm but friendly, "I've read your story, and I want to commend you for your courage. I believe we have an opportunity to turn this into something bigger." James raised an eyebrow. "What do you have in mind, Senator?" "I'm drafting a bill that would mandate anti-discrimination training for all airline employees and establish stricter penalties for cases involving service members. I'd like you to testify before Congress to share your experience and lend your support to the legislation." James was momentarily taken aback. Testifying before Congress was a significant step, one that would put him in the national spotlight. But the chance to influence real policy change was too important to pass up. "I'd be honored, Senator," he said. "Good," Crawford replied. "We'll be in touch with the details, and Colonel, know that you have my full support." After the call, James sat in silence, the gravity of the situation sinking in. He was no longer just fighting for his own dignity. He was fighting for systemic change. A week later, James arrived at Capitol Hill. The day was overcast, but the air buzzed with anticipation as cameras lined the steps of the Congressional building. Reporters shouted questions, but James kept his head high, his focus unwavering. Inside, the hearing room was packed. Veterans, activists, and airline representatives filled the seats, their faces a mix of determination and apprehension. Senator Crawford began the session with a powerful opening statement. "Today, we are here to address an issue that strikes at the core of who we are as a nation. No service member should ever face discrimination, especially while wearing the uniform of this country. Colonel Turner's story is a stark reminder of the work we still need to do." When it was James's turn to speak, he stood and approached the microphone. The room fell silent as he began. "Good morning. My name is Colonel James Turner. I've served in the United States Army for over 25 years. I've led troops in combat, trained future leaders, and dedicated my life to the values this country stands for. But on a routine flight to escort a fallen soldier, I was treated as though my service and my dignity meant nothing." James paused, letting his words sink in. He recounted the incident once more, his voice steady but impassioned. He spoke of the larger implications, highlighting the need for accountability and systemic reform. By the time he finished, the room was quiet, the weight of his testimony palpable. As the hearing continued, more stories emerged, each adding to the case for change. By the end of the day, it was clear that the momentum was building. But as James left the hearing, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from an anonymous number, and the text was brief. "Watch your back. Not everyone wants change." James stared at the screen, his resolve hardening. The fight was far from over. James read the message again, his mind immediately on high alert. He glanced around the crowded hallway outside the hearing room, scanning the faces of people milling about. No one seemed out of place, but the message was a clear warning. He took a deep breath, saving the number before pocketing his phone. He faced danger before, in war zones, under enemy fire, but this was different. This was a battle fought in boardrooms, courtrooms, and now in the shadows. James decided not to mention the message to anyone yet. He would assess the situation and take precautions. After all, his focus needed to remain on the mission at hand, pushing for systemic change. The following morning, James returned to his hotel and found a small envelope slid under his door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with the words, "Back off or the next coffin might be yours." James's pulse quickened, but his face remained stoic. He carefully placed the note in a plastic bag, preserving any potential evidence. After a moment's thought, he contacted Major General Harper, explaining both the text message and the note. "Colonel, this is serious," Harper said, his tone grim. "We'll get security involved immediately. You'll have protection from now on, and we'll trace that message and note." "Thank you, sir," James replied. "But I'm not backing down." "Good," Harper said. "We can't afford to let intimidation silence us. I'll make sure the Pentagon's cybersecurity team prioritizes this. We'll find out who's behind it." By the end of the day, 2 plainclothes agents were assigned to shadow James, ensuring his safety without drawing unnecessary attention. Despite the increased security, James's resolve only grew stronger. As the days passed, the media frenzy surrounding James's testimony intensified. The story wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the broader issues of discrimination and respect for military service members. Public opinion was sharply divided. Supporters flooded James's social media with messages of encouragement. Veterans from across the country shared their own stories of mistreatment, and advocacy groups rallied behind him. But the backlash was equally fierce. Anonymous accounts hurled insults, accusing James of playing the race card or disrespecting the uniform by speaking out. Some even claimed he was fabricating the entire incident for personal gain. One evening, while reviewing the latest developments with his task force, James received a call from Lisa Bradford. Her voice was tense. "Colonel Turner, I thought you should know. Someone's leaking false information about you. They're trying to discredit your military record, suggesting you were reprimanded in the past." James clenched his jaw. "That's a lie. My record is spotless." "I know," Lisa said. "I've already fact-checked it, and I'm preparing a rebuttal article. But this shows they're getting desperate. They want to undermine your credibility." "Let them try," James said firmly. "The truth is on our side." Lisa paused, then added, "Be careful, Colonel. Whoever's behind this won't stop easily." A week later, as James prepared for his second round of hearings, another extreme event unfolded. He was walking through a secure parking lot toward the Pentagon when his phone buzzed with an urgent alert. It was a text from one of the agents assigned to him. "Stay put. There's a potential threat near your location." James froze, instinctively scanning his surroundings. Within moments, the agents appeared, their eyes sharp as they guided him to a nearby security checkpoint. "What's going on?" James asked. One of the agents spoke in a low voice. "We intercepted chatter about a planned attack on a high-profile target involved in the hearings. We believe it's linked to your testimony." James felt a cold weight settle in his chest. "Do we know who's behind it?" "Not yet, but we're working on it. For now, we're increasing your security detail." As they escorted James back to the Pentagon, the reality of the situation became even clearer. This wasn't just about policy changes or public perception. It was about confronting powerful forces that were determined to maintain the status quo, no matter the cost. Inside the Pentagon, James met with Major General Harper and the task force. Harper's expression was grave. "Colonel, we traced the threats back to a private network. It's sophisticated, likely funded by individuals with significant resources. We're working with federal agencies to track them down, but it's going to take time." James nodded. "Time we don't have. Every delay gives them another chance to silence us." "We're aware," Harper said, "but we're not alone in this fight. Senator Crawford and several other key officials are pushing to fast-track the legislation. We need to stay focused." James stood, his determination unwavering. "Then let's make sure they know we're not backing down." Harper nodded. "Agreed. But from now on, every move we make will be under scrutiny. Stay vigilant, Colonel." That night, James returned to his hotel under heavy guard. As he sat by the window, looking out over the city, he thought about the message he'd received earlier. "Watch your back. Not everyone wants change." He knew the path ahead would be dangerous, but he also knew that change never came without a fight, and he was ready for whatever came next. Suddenly, there was a loud knock at the door. James stood cautiously, signaling one of the agents outside. The agent opened the door, revealing a uniformed courier holding a sealed envelope. "This just arrived for you, Colonel," the courier said, handing over the envelope before quickly departing. James opened it carefully. Inside was a single piece of paper with a typed message. "You've been warned. Next time, we won't miss." James stared at the note, his expression hardening. The battle had just escalated, and his enemies were growing bolder. But so was he. James tightened his grip on the note, the threat pulsing in his mind. He handed it to one of the agents without a word. The agent immediately scanned it with a handheld device before sealing it in an evidence bag. "We'll get this analyzed, sir," the agent said. "It's likely from the same group, but we'll confirm." James nodded, his face unreadable. "Let's make sure we stay a step ahead." That night, sleep was elusive. James replayed every decision, every moment that had led to this point. He had faced combat in hostile territories, but the stakes here felt even more personal. This wasn't just about him. It was about standing up for every soldier who had been treated unfairly, for every family who had suffered in silence. The next morning, James met with Major General Harper and the task force in a secure conference room. Tension was high as Harper laid out the latest developments. "Our cybersecurity team has identified key players behind the threats," Harper began, his tone grim. "It appears to be a coordinated effort involving individuals with deep ties to both private industry and extremist groups." Dr. Alan Jacobs, the civilian expert on the task force, interjected. "We've seen this pattern before. Groups like this thrive on fear and misinformation. They're targeting you, Colonel, because your story threatens their narrative." James leaned forward. "What's our next move?" Harper exchanged a look with Lieutenant Commander Simmons before answering. "We're tightening security measures around you and anyone else involved in the hearings. Additionally, the FBI has agreed to take point on the investigation into these threats. They'll be coordinating with us directly." James nodded. "And the legislation?" Senator Crawford's aide, who had joined the meeting remotely, spoke up. "It's moving faster than expected. Your testimony, along with the overwhelming public support, has put significant pressure on Congress. We're optimistic about a vote in the coming weeks." James allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Progress was being made, but he knew the fight was far from over. Later that day, James was scheduled to appear on a high-profile news program. The goal was to keep the momentum going, to ensure the public remained engaged and informed. As the cameras rolled, the interviewer, a seasoned journalist known for her incisive questioning, dove straight in. "Colonel Turner, your story has captivated the nation. But with the growing controversy, some critics have accused you of over-exaggerating your experience to push a personal agenda. How do you respond to that?" James' expression remained calm. "My agenda has always been clear: respect and dignity for all service members, regardless of their background. What happened to me is not an isolated incident. It's part of a larger pattern that needs to be addressed. The focus should be on fixing the problem, not deflecting it." The interviewer nodded, pressing on. "Given the threats you've received, do you fear for your safety?" James hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "I won't deny that the threats are concerning. But I faced danger before, and I'm not backing down now. This is bigger than me, and I won't let fear dictate my actions." The interview concluded with a strong call to action, urging viewers to support the legislation and hold organizations accountable for their practices. As James left the studio, his security detail remained close. The streets outside were crowded, and for a moment, James felt the weight of the public's gaze. Some people stopped to offer words of support, while others cut their distance, their expressions unreadable. Suddenly, a commotion erupted near the corner of the street. A man in a dark hoodie pushed through the crowd, heading straight for James. "Colonel Turner," the man shouted, his hand reaching into his jacket. In an instant, James's security detail sprang into action, drawing their weapons and forming a protective barrier around him. "Get down," one of the agents barked as the crowd scattered, screams echoing through the air. The man froze, his hands raised, but not before pulling out a piece of paper. "Wait, it's just a letter," he yelled, his voice shaking. The agents quickly subdued him, checking him for weapons before retrieving the letter. Once the situation was under control, they handed the note to James. The message was brief, written in shaky handwriting. "They're watching everyone. Be careful who you trust." James looked up at the man, who was now being questioned by the agents. "Who sent you?" The man shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "I don't know. I just found the letter in my mailbox this morning. It had your name on it, and I thought you should see it." James exchanged a look with the lead agent, who nodded. "We'll verify his story, but this could be another attempt to sow confusion, the agent said. James pocketed the note, his resolve hardening. The opposition was getting more desperate, and the stakes were rising. That evening, James returned to his hotel, exhausted but determined. As he sat at his desk, reviewing his notes for the next hearing, his phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Harper. "We've uncovered evidence linking the threats to a powerful lobbying group with ties to the airline industry. Details forthcoming. Stay sharp." James stared at the message, his mind racing. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was more dangerous than he had anticipated. Before he could respond, the lights in his hotel room flickered. A moment later, the power went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. James stood, his instincts kicking in. He reached for his phone, only to find that it, too, had lost service. A knock sounded at the door. "Colonel Turner, it's Agent Price," came a low voice from the other side. James approached cautiously, peering through the peephole. He recognized the agent's face and unlocked the door. "Power outage across the block," Price said, stepping inside. "Could be a coincidence, but we're not taking any chances. We're moving you to a secure location." James nodded, quickly gathering his essentials. As they stepped into the hallway, Price leaned in. "Sir, I think we're getting close to the truth. But whoever we're dealing with, they're not playing by the rules." James's eyes narrowed. "Neither am I." They exited the building, moving swiftly toward an armored SUV waiting at the curb. As they drove into the night, James couldn't shake the feeling that the next move in this dangerous game was about to unfold. The armored SUV cut through the dimly lit streets of Washington, D.C., its passengers silent but alert. James sat in the back, flanked by Agent Price and another plainclothes operative. The weight of the past few days hung heavy, but his mind remained sharp, assessing every turn, every shadow that passed by the windows. Price glanced back at James. "We're taking you to a secure Pentagon facility. It's off the grid, minimal personnel, fully protected." James nodded, his eyes scanning the streets. "What do we know about the group behind this?" Price hesitated. "Preliminary intel suggests they're operating under the guise of a lobbying firm, but their reach goes far beyond corporate interests. We're talking about a network with ties to extremist cells and even some rogue political actors." James's jaw tightened. "So it's not just about protecting their business. It's about silencing anyone who threatens their influence." "Exactly," Price said. "They see your push for accountability as a direct threat to their operations, and are willing to go to extreme lengths to stop you." When they arrived at the facility, James was quickly ushered inside. The building was unremarkable on the outside, blending seamlessly with its surroundings, but inside it was a fortress. Thick walls, surveillance systems, and armed guards at every corner. Price led James to a secure briefing room where Major General Harper was waiting. On the table before him were stacks of documents, a laptop, and a secure phone. Harper looked up, his expression grim but focused. "Colonel, glad you made it safely," Harper said, motioning for James to sit. James took a seat, his eyes immediately drawn to the documents. "What's the latest?" Harper slid a file across the table. "We've confirmed that the threats are coming from a group calling themselves Sentinel Solutions. Officially, they're a lobbying firm specializing in defense and aviation contracts. Unofficially, they're a front for a network that uses intimidation and bribery to maintain control over key industries." James flipped through the file, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the names listed. "And these people think they can get away with this." "They've gotten away with it for years," Harper said. "But your case has put them under a spotlight. They're desperate, which makes them dangerous." Price, who had been quietly reviewing a live feed from the security team, spoke up. "We've also identified a pattern in their communications. It looks like they're planning another move, possibly tonight." James leaned forward. "What kind of move?" "We're not sure yet," Price admitted, "but they're escalating. They've activated more of their operatives, which suggests they're planning something significant." Harper nodded. "We've already informed the FBI and Homeland Security. They're coordinating with us to monitor potential targets and intercept any actionable threats." James took a deep breath, his mind racing. "We need to stay ahead of them. If they're planning something big, we need to be ready." Harper tapped the table, his expression resolute. "Agreed. But we also need to keep the public informed. Transparency is our best weapon right now. The more people know about what's happening, the harder it'll be for Sentinel Solutions to operate in the shadows." James considered this for a moment. "Then we need to make sure the next hearing goes forward as planned. If they're trying to stop me, that's where we hit back." Harper's eyes met James's, a glimmer of respect in his gaze. "You're right. We can't let them dictate the terms, but we'll need to be prepared for anything." Hours later, James sat alone in his temporary quarters, reviewing his notes for the upcoming hearing. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Outside, the facility was a hive of activity, with security personnel running drills and monitoring surveillance feeds. As he stared at his notes, his thoughts drifted to Kyle Matthews, the young soldier whose death had set this chain of events in motion. James thought about Kyle's family, their grief still fresh, their faith in him unwavering. This fight wasn't just for them. It was for every soldier who had been marginalized, every family who had been wronged. Suddenly, his secure phone buzzed on the desk, breaking the silence. It was a direct line to Harper. "Colonel Turner." Harper's voice came through tense. "We got a situation. One of our surveillance teams picked up chatter about a coordinated cyber attack targeting the hearing tomorrow." James sat up straight. "Cyber attack? What's the target?" "The communication systems for the entire Congressional building," Harper said. "They're planning to disrupt the hearing, possibly leak sensitive information to discredit you and the task force." James's mind raced. "Can we stop it?" "We're working on it," Harper said. "Our cyber defense team is already in place, but Sentinel Solutions has some of the best hackers money can buy. It's going to be a battle." James stood, pacing the room. "If they succeed, it could derail everything we've worked for." "Exactly," Harper replied, "but we're not going to let that happen. I want you to focus on the hearing. Let us handle the cyber threat." James nodded, though a sense of unease lingered. "Understood, sir. Just make sure we're ready." "We will be," Harper said. "And Colonel, stay vigilant. If they're attacking on multiple fronts, we can't rule out a physical threat." After the call ended, James sat back down, his resolve hardening. He knew the risks were escalating, but he also knew that backing down wasn't an option. The next morning, James arrived at the Congressional building under heavy guard. The atmosphere was tense, with security checkpoints reinforced and staff on high alert. As the hearing began, Senator Crawford opened with a powerful statement, reaffirming the importance of the legislation and the need for accountability. James listened intently, ready for his turn to speak. But just as he was about to be called to the stand, a sudden buzz of activity swept through the room. Staff members whispered urgently into their earpieces, their expressions shifting from concern to alarm. Senator Crawford paused, her eyes narrowing as she looked toward the security personnel at the back of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice steady but firm, "we've just been informed of a security threat. For everyone's safety, we're suspending the hearing temporarily." The room erupted in murmurs as people began to gather their belongings. James stood, his eyes meeting Harper's across the room. Harper gave him a slight nod, signaling that the situation was under control for now. As the room cleared, James's phone buzzed again. It was another encrypted message from Price. "The attack has started. They're targeting multiple systems. Hold your position. We'll update you soon." James clenched his jaw, feeling the weight of the moment. The battle was far from over, and the enemy was closer than ever. The hearing room emptied quickly, the tension thick as senators, aides, and security personnel moved with purpose. James remained in his seat, watching the controlled chaos unfold around him. He could feel the pressure mounting with each passing second. His phone buzzed again, another update from Price. "We've neutralized 2 intrusion attempts. They're persistent. Stay put." James exhaled slowly, his military training keeping him calm under the circumstances. He scanned the room, his eyes falling on Senator Crawford, who stood near a cluster of security officials. She caught his gaze and walked over, her face set in a determined expression. "Colonel Turner, I'm sorry for the interruption," she said. "We're dealing with a significant cyber threat, but our teams are holding the line. We'll resume the hearing as soon as it's safe." "I understand, Senator," James replied. "If Sentinel Solutions is behind this, it only proves how desperate they are to stop us." Crawford nodded, "And it only strengthens our resolve. Stay ready, Colonel. When we get back in that room, your testimony will be more important than ever." James gave her a firm nod. "I'll be ready." In a nearby control room, Major General Harper and a team of cybersecurity experts worked tirelessly. Screens displayed lines of code, network maps, and real-time alerts as the team fought to repel the cyber attack. Harper stood behind the lead technician, his arms crossed. "They're probing for weak points," the technician said, his fingers flying over the keyboard, "targeting internal communications and trying to access classified files." "Can they get through?" Harper asked. Not if we keep up this counteroffensive, the technician replied. But they're good, really good. Harper's phone buzzed. It was Price. General, physical security is holding steady, but we've spotted unusual activity around the building. Unmarked vans, individuals loitering longer than normal. Could be nothing, but we're monitoring. Harper's brow furrowed. Stay on it. We can't afford any surprises. Yes, sir, Price said before ending the call. Harper turned back to the screens. We need to buy more time. Keep them occupied. Back in the secure waiting area, James sat with Senator Crawford and a few other officials. The air was tense, but James remained focused. He pulled out his notes, reviewing key points for his testimony. Crawford watched him for a moment before speaking. You've handled all of this with remarkable composure, Colonel. Most people would be rattled. James looked up, a hint of a smile on his face. I faced worse, Senator, but this fight is different. It's personal. Before Crawford could respond, a security officer entered the room. Senator, Colonel, we've received word from the control center. The immediate cyber threat has been contained, and we're ready to resume the hearing. Crawford stood, straightening her blazer. Let's get to it, then. James followed her back to the hearing room, his steps steady. The room was already filling up again, the previous tension replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. Once everyone was seated, Crawford called the session back to order. Thank you all for your patience, she began. The threats we'd face today are a stark reminder of why we're here. There are forces that want to silence us, to maintain a status quo that allows discrimination and injustice to persist. We won't let them succeed. She turned to James. Colonel Turner, you may proceed with your testimony. James rose and approached the stand. The room fell silent as he began to speak. I stand before you today not just as a soldier, but as a witness to the systemic issues that have plagued our military and society for too long. My experience at the airport was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a deeper problem, one that affects countless service members, especially those from marginalized backgrounds. James spoke with conviction, recounting his journey and the challenges he faced. He highlighted the broader implications of the discrimination he encountered and called for comprehensive reforms. As he concluded, his voice rang with determination. We owe it to every soldier who has served this country to ensure they are treated with the respect and dignity they deserve. This is not just a fight for fairness, it's a fight for the very values we claim to uphold. The room erupted in applause. Even those who had been skeptical seemed moved by James's testimony. Crawford leaned forward, her eyes shining with determination. Thank you, Colonel Turner. Your courage and candor are exactly what we need to drive this change. As the hearing continued, James felt a sense of accomplishment, but he knew the battle wasn't over. After the session adjourned, he returned to the secure facility to regroup with Harper and the task force. Harper greeted him with a firm handshake. Well done, Colonel. Your testimony was powerful. It's already making waves. James nodded. Let's hope it's enough to push the legislation through. It's a strong start, Harper said, but we've uncovered more about Sentinel solutions. They're planning to escalate their efforts. We need to stay vigilant. Price entered the room, his expression serious. Sir, we've intercepted another communication from Sentinel. They're shifting their focus to a new target, public opinion. They're planning a massive disinformation campaign. Harper's eyes narrowed. What's their angle? They're going to paint the colonel as a divisive figure, Price explained. They're pushing narratives that question his credibility and intentions. If they can sway public opinion, they'll weaken our position. James exhaled sharply. Then we counter it. We keep the truth front and center. Harper nodded. Agreed. We'll coordinate with media outlets and ensure our message stays clear. They won't control the narrative. But even as they strategized, James couldn't shake the feeling that Sentinel had more tricks up their sleeve. The fight was intensifying, and the next move could be their most dangerous yet. The disinformation campaign launched by Sentinel Solutions was swift and ruthless. Within hours of James's testimony, social media platforms lit up with fabricated stories, doctored photos, and malicious rumors. Anonymous accounts accused James of exaggerating his experience, while others claimed he was using his military status for political gain. Headlines from fringe media outlets screamed, Colonel Turner, hero or opportunist, and disgraced officer pushes personal agenda under the guise of reform. James, sitting in the secure briefing room with Major General Harper and Agent Price, scrolled through the flood of online attacks. His jaw clenched as he saw the lies spreading like wildfire. They're throwing everything they've got, Harper said, his voice low. They're hoping to discredit you before the legislation gains more traction. Price nodded. Their strategy is clear. If they can make you look like a divisive figure, they can shift the focus away from the systemic issues we're addressing. James set his phone down, his expression calm but resolute. Then we need to hit back harder. Every lie they tell, we counter with the truth. Harper leaned forward. We've already activated our media response team. Lissa Bradford is working on a piece to expose Sentinel's tactics, and several major outlets are lining up interviews with you. We'll keep the narrative in our favor. Price added, we've also identified some of the key accounts spreading disinformation. They're bots and troll farms linked to Sentinel's network. We flagged them for removal, but it'll take time to clean up. James nodded. Good, but we need more than just damage control. We need to show the public exactly who Sentinel Solutions is and what they're trying to protect. Harper's eyes lit up. We've been compiling evidence, financial records, internal communications, testimonies from former employees. If we release it strategically, it'll expose their entire operation. Let's do it, James said firmly. They want to play dirty. We'll beat them with facts. The next morning, James appeared on several national news programs. The interviews were intense, with hosts diving into both the disinformation campaign and the systemic issues James had highlighted. In one interview, a host asked, Colonel Turner, how do you respond to those who claim you're pushing a personal agenda? James leaned forward, his tone measured but passionate. My agenda is simple: respect and equality for every service member. The attacks against me are a distraction, a calculated effort to silence the truth, but the facts don't lie. Discrimination exists, and it's our duty to confront it head-on. The host nodded. And what about Sentinel Solutions? There's mounting evidence linking them to these attacks. James didn't hesitate. Sentinel Solutions represents everything we're fighting against, an entrenched system that prioritizes profit and power over people. They're scared because they know their time is up. The interview resonated with viewers, and public support for James began to swell. Hashtags like hashtag Stand with Colin L. Turner and hashtag Veterans Deserve Better trended across social media, drowning out much of the disinformation. Meanwhile, Lissa Bradford's investigative piece on Sentinel Solutions hit the front page of the Washington Post. The article laid bare the company's corrupt practices, bribing officials to secure favorable contracts, intimidating whistleblowers to keep their operations hidden, orchestrating smear campaigns against anyone who posed a threat. The report included damning internal emails and first-hand accounts from former employees who described the company's ruthless tactics. The public reaction was immediate and furious. Protests erupted outside Sentinel's headquarters, with demonstrators demanding accountability. Several high-profile politicians, including Senator Crawford, called for an official investigation into the company. As the pressure mounted, James and the task force prepared for the next stage of the fight. Harper called an emergency meeting to discuss their next moves. Sentinel is on the ropes, Harper said, his voice filled with a rare note of satisfaction. But they're not done. We've intercepted chatter suggesting they're planning a direct attack on you, Colonel. This time, it won't be just words. Price elaborated. We've identified a credible threat against your life. We're tightening security, but you need to be aware. Sentinel is getting desperate. James' expression hardened. Let them come. I faced worse. Harper shook his head. This is different, Colonel. They're cornered, and that makes them unpredictable. We can't afford to underestimate them. Price added, we got teams monitoring their movements, but we'll need you to stick to secure locations and follow our protocols to the letter. James nodded. Understood, but I won't stop speaking out. They won't intimidate me into silence. Later that night, James returned to his secure quarters, his mind racing. He knew the next few days would be critical. Sentinel's power was crumbling, but their desperation made them more dangerous than ever. As he sat at his desk, reviewing notes for an upcoming rally, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. We're closer than you think. This ends tonight. James immediately alerted his security detail. Within moments, Price and a team of agents were in his room, analyzing the message. Price's face was grim. They're escalating. We're moving you to a different location now. The team quickly escorted James out of the building and into a waiting convoy. The streets were eerily quiet as they navigated toward a more secure facility. But as they approached an intersection, the lead SUV suddenly swerved, its tires screeching. A black van had cut them off, and armed men began pouring out, weapons drawn. Ambush. Price shouted. "Colonel, stay down." Gunfire erupted, shattering the night's silence. James crouched low as the agents returned fire, their training and precision keeping the attackers at bay. The firefight was intense, but the agents' superior tactics quickly turned the tide. Within minutes, the attackers were subdued, some fleeing as law enforcement backup arrived. James stepped out of the SUV, his heart pounding but his resolve unshaken. Price approached, his face flushed but focused. "They're getting bolder," Price said. "But we've got their operatives in custody." "Woke answers." James nodded, his eyes fixed on the van as the attackers were hauled away. Sentinel just made their biggest mistake. He knew this ambush would only strengthen their case. Sentinel's downfall was inevitable, and James was more determined than ever to see it through to the end. The aftermath of the ambush was a whirlwind of activity. Within hours, the captured operatives were in custody, and federal agents began extracting critical information. Sentinel's network, once a shadowy enigma, was now unraveling. James, back at the secure facility, was debriefed by Major General Harper and Agent Price. The air was tense but filled with a palpable sense of momentum. "One of the operatives is talking," Price said, his tone measured. "He's confirmed that Sentinel orchestrated the ambush as a last-ditch effort to take you out and derail the hearings." Harper leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "More importantly, he's given us access to a hidden cache of documents, blueprints of their operations, including detailed plans to influence key political figures and undermine investigations." James' eyes narrowed. "And the people pulling the strings?" "We're getting closer," Harper said. "The documents name several high-ranking executives, lobbyists, and even a few rogue government officials. They've been funneling money and resources into Sentinel's operations for years." Price added, "We've also discovered links to a private security firm that Sentinel has been using for covert operations. These are highly trained mercenaries, not just hired thugs." James nodded, absorbing the gravity of the situation. "We need to move fast. The longer we wait, the more time they have to cover their tracks." Harper agreed. "We've already coordinated with the Justice Department. A raid on Sentinel's main headquarters is set for tomorrow morning. This will be a coordinated strike to seize their assets and arrest key players." James felt a surge of determination. "It's about time we took the fight to them." The next day, just before dawn, federal agents surrounded Sentinel Solutions headquarters. Helicopters circled above while tactical teams prepared to breach the building. James watched from a command center, his eyes fixed on the live feed streaming from the operation. Harper stood beside him, providing updates. "We've got agents positioned at every entry point. Once the signal is given, they'll move in." Moments later, the lead agent's voice came over the radio. "Teams are in position, awaiting your go." Harper nodded to the operations commander. "Execute." The feeds showed agents breaching the building with precision, moving swiftly through offices and securing critical areas. Within minutes, several high-ranking executives were in custody, their shocked faces a stark contrast to the confidence they once wielded. In one of the upper floors, agents uncovered a hidden server room filled with encrypted files. It was a treasure trove of evidence, financial transactions, communications with corrupt officials, and plans for future operations. "We've hit the jackpot," Harper said, a rare smile crossing his face. As the operation concluded, James felt a weight lift. Sentinel's stronghold was finally crumbling. Later that day, James and Harper were briefed on the evidence recovered. Among the files was a detailed dossier on James himself, including surveillance photos, personal information, and a timeline of their planned attacks against him. "They've been watching you for months," Price said, his tone grave. "They knew every move you made." James exhaled slowly, the reality of how close to Sentinel had been hitting hard. "And now it's over." "Almost," Harper said. "There's still one loose end." He slid a document across the table. It was a profile of Sentinel's elusive CEO, Richard Voss, a man who had kept himself hidden in the shadows, pulling strings from behind the scenes. "Voss is the mastermind," Harper explained. "We believe he's fled the country, but we've got leads on his whereabouts. The Justice Department is working with Interpol to track him down." James's eyes narrowed. "We need to bring him to justice. He can't be allowed to escape accountability." Harper nodded. "And we will. But in the meantime, the evidence we've gathered is more than enough to dismantle Sentinel's operations and push the legislation through Congress." That evening, James appeared at a press conference alongside Senator Crawford and Major General Harper. The public was eager for updates, and the mood was electric as Crawford stepped up to the podium. "Today marks a turning point," Crawford began. "Thanks to the bravery and perseverance of Colonel Turner and the tireless efforts of our law enforcement agencies, we have dismantled one of the most corrupt and dangerous networks operating in our country." She turned to James, her expression proud. "Colonel Turner's courage has not only exposed these injustices, but has also inspired legislation that will ensure no service member ever faces such discrimination again." James stepped forward, the cameras flashing as he began to speak. "This fight has never been about me. It's not the countless men and women who serve this nation with honor, only to face indignities that undermine their sacrifices. Today, we've taken a significant step toward justice, but the work is far from over. Together, we'll continue to push for a system that respects and protects all who wear the uniform." The crowd erupted in applause, and James felt a sense of fulfillment. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to breathe deeply, knowing that real change was within reach. As the press conference ended and the crowd dispersed, James's phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. He was here to visit the grave of Private First Class Kyle Matthews, the soldier whose final journey had sparked this monumental fight. James placed a hand on the headstone, his voice low. "You didn't know it, Kyle, but you inspired something bigger than any of us could have imagined. Your sacrifice wasn't in vain." As he stood there, the weight of the journey he had undertaken felt lighter. The fight for justice and equality was far from over, but for the first time, James felt a sense of peace. He turned to leave, ready for whatever battles lay ahead. Because the war for dignity and respect was ongoing, and James Turner would never stop fighting. James returned to his daily routine, but life would never be the same. The events of the past months had transformed him from a decorated colonel into a national symbol of perseverance and justice. His story had sparked a movement, not just within the military but across the nation. Veterans from all backgrounds began sharing their experiences, pushing for reforms in industries beyond aviation. The ripple effects were undeniable. Policies were updated, training programs overhauled, and accountability mechanisms strengthened. James continued his work with the task force, now a permanent body dedicated to addressing systemic inequalities affecting service members. He also became a sought-after speaker, addressing crowds at universities, military bases, and civic organizations. His message was simple but powerful. Respect is not a privilege, it's a right, and together we must fight for it every day. One evening, James received a letter from Kyle Matthews' younger sister, Emily. Her words brought him back to the core of his mission. "Dear Colonel Turner, thank you for everything you've done. My brother always believed in standing up for what's right. Because of you, his legacy will live on, not just in our family, but in the lives of so many others. You've shown the world that one voice can make a difference. With gratitude, Emily." James read the letter twice, feeling both pride and humility. It was a reminder of why he had started this fight and why he would never stop. Years later, James would look back on this chapter of his life as a turning point, not just for him, but for the nation. His efforts had helped pave the way for a more inclusive and respectful society, proving that even the most entrenched systems could be challenged and changed. Standing on the foundation of his hard-fought victories, James Turner remained steadfast, knowing that the fight for justice and equality was a lifelong mission, and he was ready for whatever came next.